Well, then thank you guys so much for being patient. I am Chris. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, and I'm presenting on a very fun project that I did with my friend and collaborator, Sami Abu-El-Haija, who's here to help with answering questions in the chat. And we're going to talk to you today about human languages in source code. How can we translate and localize instruction? So if you have questions, you can ask in the chat or you can hit us up on Twitter. And just as a little bit of background, we care a lot about this because we come from different locations in the world. Sami is from Jordan. I grew up in Kenya and Malaysia. And it's led us to think a lot about how we can teach for people who are in different countries. And just to start out with a little empathy, I just want to start by asking you guys to try and figure out, what does this code do? And on some level, you're like, Chris, this is hard for me to understand because this code is in Chinese, and perhaps you don't speak Chinese. And on some level, this is an experience that a whole bunch of students are having in the world. How many people have an experience like this where they have to look at code in a language they don't understand? Well, it turns out a lot of people. Why? Because most of the code in the world is in English, but most of the world does not speak English. So 80% of the world is not English speaker. Only about 5% of the world speaks it as a mother tongue. But most code in the world, so if you want to learn how to program, most code in the world is in English. If we look at GitHub Java, about 88% of all the code is in English. And this community has done a fantastic job of talking about how big a problem that is. It means a lot for learners. If you don't speak English as your mother tongue, it is very hard to learn. And this is a huge impediment, as people in this community have showed, to talking about computer science for all. So before this project, there did not exist a tool to translate code between human languages. And so we have a very simple goal ahead of us. Let's build that tool. So when I say there doesn't exist a tool, on some level you must be like, wait, Chris, isn't there already Google Translate? Can't we just use that? So let's try it. Let's take this code that's written in English and let's try and translate it into Chinese. We can put it into Google Translate, but basically Google Translate does everything wrong. Everything that shouldn't be translated gets translated, and everything that should be translated does not. So if we take a look at this line, for those of you who program, public and class, those are keywords to Java. You should not translate them. Whereas moonweight, that's some sort of like English term that you should translate. But you see, Google does everything opposite. It translates all the keywords and does not translate any identifiers. So there's just not a very nice solution for people who want to switch their code from one human language to another. And we can keep going down to this exact same thing, like public, static, final, double. Don't translate those. Fraction, definitely translate that. What happens? Sad times. So of course, people can do translation by hand. You can take moonweight, you can break it up, you can translate. But I really think that if we had a tool that could do this translation in a smooth, seamless fashion, there's a whole bunch of things that we could do to make tools easier for programmers and for learners alike. So today we're going to do three things. One, we're going to look at all of GitHub to see how people actually do use human languages in code. Then we're going to build a tool that will do this translation. And finally, we're going to translate a textbook so that people can learn programming in whatever language they choose. A couple of vocabulary items I'm going to use today. I'm going to sometimes use this term L1 language. That just means your mother tongue. So that's your primary language, the one you first learned. Transliteration is like translation, but you don't change languages, you just change scripts. So this is transliteration of a Hindi script into the Roman script that we use. And translation takes it a step further. You take either a script or words in another language and you translate it into a different language. A right to left languages, that's Arabic or Hebrew. Those are languages where instead of writing from left to right, you write right to left. Okay, let's jump in. Let's start by looking at GitHub. Do you know there's 2.9 million public repositories on GitHub in Java? Let's download all of those and let's take a look at how people are actually using different human languages in these GitHub. And to the best of our knowledge, we're going to be the first ones to do that. When we do this, we look at what languages people are using. There's a lot of code with different languages, and it's very well spread out. The most common language is Chinese, but you see everything from Portuguese to Spanish to French to Swahili to Bahasa Melayu. Okay, when we look at code, there's kind of three things that we look at. We look at what language do people use in comments? What language do they use in these things called identifiers, like their variable names or their function names? And then we see what language people use in their commit messages. So this is an example of people using English in those two contexts. Here's an example of people using a script in those different contexts. And here's an example of people using transliteration in those contexts. By transliteration, I mean something like, this is in Russian, but instead of being in Russian script, it's written in Arabic or Roman script. And here, this is the same thing. This is in Vietnamese, but instead of being in Vietnamese script, it's written in ASCII. Okay. interesting insight we've discovered, you can better estimate somebody's mother tongue if you look at their commit messages than if you look at their comments or their identifiers. So a little bit of suspense. Let's look at all this data. What's it going to tell us? Well, it tells us a pretty interesting story of how people code, and it's different by language. Like if we look at French speakers use a ton of French in their identifiers and a ton of French in their comments. If you look at Korean speakers, there's a very different pattern. Korean speakers, yes, they write a lot of Korean in their comments, but they hardly ever use Korean in their identifiers. And then there's other languages like Dutch where there's less of both. And actually, if we look at all languages, some interesting patterns emerge. In one side, you have the Western European coders, the people who speak French, Spanish, Portuguese, German. They love to write code in their own languages. They write their identifiers and their comments in their own languages. In another group, you have your non-Latin script languages. So Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and Russian. These languages don't use something that can be represented by ASCII. And interestingly, they tend not to use their own languages and identifiers. They tend to use English in their identifiers, but they write comments in their own language. And then there's this other group, which I think is very interesting, and they tend to be not other scripts and not Western European languages. And I really think of these as languages where English is slightly more dominant and growing in dominance. And I think a lot about how we can preserve these languages. But anyways, there's a whole bunch of languages where people use their own languages for identifiers, but tend to write comments in English. Small little note, everybody seems to transliterate their variable names and their function names. So people very rarely use scripts for variable names. And then the Spanish and French tend to transliterate their comments a little bit more, but that's not that important right now. What is, there's a couple other takeaways though. One thing that is important is we looked at all of GitHub and we saw 0 examples with right to left languages in comments or in identifiers. So it goes. Anyways, this tells us a story. This just tells a story of people, how they use their languages in code, but it really talks about people are mixing languages. And to that extent, it paints a picture of people who would benefit from human language translation. How are we going to do this? Well, it's pretty simple. If you take a line like this, the simple idea is don't translate keywords, but do translate identifiers. And when you translate identifiers, it's not that complicated. You can just take your identifier, use a little bit of AI to split it up, and then translate the words independently and put them back together. Good times. Couple side notes, a gotcha one. Hey, if you translate things like I, Google will think that means the personal pronoun I. So if for those of you who speak Spanish, it's a little funny. It's like for I, Chris, equals 0, I is less than 3I plus plus. Another thing that we learned is method names should have a verb prior. So if somebody says move, they don't mean movement, they mean the action move. And then Sami did this incredibly cool thing, which is we figured out how to do translation to Arabic. People do use transliteration. We learned that from looking at GitHub. And Sami invented a particular transliteration that works for code. So you can transliterate code. You can come up with identifiers that make sense to Arabic speakers, but also compile nicely, and they work left to right. A couple other gotchas. We put a lot of energy into thinking how we can make a whole system that works. And we do things like collect our identifiers before you do our translation so that when you translate your comments, you can be consistent with your identifiers. You remember that we're going to do a textbook at the end of the day. So we have to do things like make sure that our translations are consistent with the rest of the text in a textbook. Check out the paper for all those gory details. But anyways, we end up with this tool that works very well. You can choose if you want to translate strings. You can make some decisions about how you want your comments translated, but basically you can put text in one language and say, give it to me in another language, but in the same programming language. CodeInternational works for Java, Python, and even HTML. And we used it to translate a textbook. So translated this Karel textbook, and we can go check it out. You can go play with it yourself. You can learn this thing called Karel, and you can learn it in Spanish. And when you learn it, we translated all the code. And also we translate it in a way that you can still run and execute and do all the sort of fun things you'd want with the code. And maybe you don't speak Spanish, maybe you speak Chinese. Great, we've got a textbook for you too. We just hit a button, auto-translate, translate it for us. Think about all the textbooks you could write in all the languages now. It's a good time. Anyways, I don't speak Chinese, so I can't get that much out of this. It's been used by a lot of people. On some level, this is because we've been using this textbook in our introductory class, but we've gotten over 10,000 people have been using this, and we're seeing a growing usage in people who are coming from countries where there's not English as a native language. you know, there's some skeptics who think that everyone should learn English. Like, why don't you just learn English before you learn to code? It's the language of code. It's a great thing that we all speak English. But I suppose we're coming at this from the mentality of like, actually, there's so many people who are not native speakers, and asking them to earn English first is just way too high a barrier. So we think we can make some progress on CS for All. Other languages are pretty straightforward. All the code is open access to you. So if you want to do something like C++, you could. And then finally, we have a goal. We want to put Wikipedia into all these languages. If you look at Wikipedia in Swahili, this is to inspire you. If you look at Wikipedia in Swahili, you do not get very much information. In English, it tells you things like V equals IR and all these incredibly important things. If you look in Swahili, you basically get a paragraph on history. So, you know, this is barrier to education beyond just code. Anyways, that's what we've got. It was a great time. Thank you guys so much for the questions, and sorry for the technical difficulties at the beginning.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris and Sami. That's fantastic work. There's a lot of good discussion in the chat. And maybe time for one question if you want to pick one out, Chris.
Fantastic. I was a little worried that I wouldn't have time. Maybe if there's one thing, maybe I would talk about this forward-thinking research on translating Wikipedia, because you know, if you think about how much we could benefit, like if you're in Kenya and you only speak Swahili, you cannot access information on things like farming technologies, you know, like stuff that you'd really want to know. You could potentially go to the English page and translate to Swahili, but that means that search engines are not optimized. You can't just type in the term and have Google push you towards Wikipedia Swahili. And I would love to see somebody make some progress on that. Anyways, thank you guys all.
Great. Thank you, Chris.